Pol Pot famously said, "My revolution came from the jungle." And what he meant by that is that most of his supporters were the most primitive and superstitious tribes that lived deep in the jungle, in the hills. And we are not talking simply about uneducated peasants that were the main base of Maoism, but we are talking literally about people that didn't know that trucks existed. Pol Pot's Secretary of Transportation actually never saw a truck in his life, and when he saw a truck, he was convinced that trucks are actually demons. So yeah, that tells us that Pol Pot's version of communism or of Marxism-Maoism was radically different from everything else that was tried and attempted to reach the utopia of Marx. His attempt was uniquely bizarre and cruel, but it also raises many questions for us historians that try to classify ideologies. Pol Pot's ideology is uniquely hard to classify, and that's why I want to try and answer the question: was Pol Pot a right-winger or a leftist Marxist? And there are good arguments to be made for both sides. For example, Jean-Louis Margolin, a French academic, argued that Pol Pot's Cambodia is simply a form of Maoism. And you don't have to be crazy in order to believe it. After all, Pol Pot did saw Mao Zedong as his idol. He did call his economic reform super great leap forward. And after all, he was convinced that Mao Zedong's great leap forward failed for actually not being radical enough, failed for still promising elements of capitalism to exist in his society. So it is not crazy to say that Pol Pot was a leftist, since he self-identified as a Marxist-Maoist. But on the other hand, Matt Gallaway argues that Pol Pot should be compared to Hitler and fascism, and that in reality his philosophy is much more comparable to fascism than to communism. And I agree that sometimes it is not enough to simply ask the dictator or regime itself to see how they self-identify, because terms politically left and right get very murky, and especially if we try to apply them on Asian despotic regimes that also had long traditions of their own. For example, Pol Pot was very much inspired by the cult of personality that the ancient Cambodian kings had, and that's why he claimed he had magical powers, and that he was actually able to control this mystical force that is located all around us. And that actually reminds me of Star Wars, but that is what all the ancient Cambodian kings claimed, and in their religion only special individuals are able to control such a force, and Pol Pot claimed he was one of them. So his supporters actually believed he had magical powers. That is also something that makes him a very different from all other communist dictators. But okay, now that we have established that Pol Pot could be seen as a form of Maoism, let me present to you a case that Pol Pot was actually a right-winger. And by the way, I have no issue admitting that both Stalin and Mao were leftists. I would definitely classify them as leftists for many reasons. Well, first of all, racism racism wasn't an integral part of both Maoism and Stalinism. A lot of hidden racism existed in both regimes, but both Stalin and Mao never would have said the nature. For example, Stalin never would have said nature of all Ukrainians is evil. He did cause Holodomor to occur, but what also needs to be said is his reason for that was he was convinced that Ukrainians were hiding grain from the Soviet state. But once he realized that millions actually died and are going to die from a lack of food, he did order the Red Army to send the grain back to Ukraine. So that is a important difference between Hitler and Stalin. For Hitler, there was nothing that could have prevented him for killing the Jews, because he saw their nature as evil. He simply saw them as irredeemable. No amount of re-education could change the fact that Jews were Jews, and that's why we classify Hitler as a fascist. While on the other hand, communists, while they did kill quite a lot of people, they insisted on this actually liberal, one could say a liberal concept, that even the most evil enemies of the regime could be redeemed by working hard in the camps for the state. And that's why most people actually did survive the gulags. Death rate in the gulags overall was 14%, which is still millions, but a crucial part of communism is still that people are not evil by their nature. It's their decisions that make them evil. And Pol Pot, unlike Stalin and Mao, actually said in one of his famous speeches, and the speech is called "Who Are We?" and Matt Gallaway brings the speech in his book, and Pol Pot explicitly states the nature of all Vietnamese people is treacherous and evil, and that makes him, in my opinion, much closer to Hitler than to Stalin and Mao. And there is also one important political test that, in my opinion, we can almost always apply in order to see whether a regime is leftist or whether we are talking about a right-wing proto-fascist regime. And that is, fascists, they tend to glorify the past. They see the past as this golden age that was lost. They see greatness in the past that was lost, and they want to restore that greatness. And often they're talking about a mythical past. For Mussolini, that was the restoration of Roman Empire. For Hitler, that was restoring the German Reich, whether we are talking about the Kaiser Wilhelm's Reich, World War I Germany, or the medieval Reich. And for example, the Croatian fascists, that is my country, claim that they have a right to rule over Bosnia because in the Middle Ages the Croatian kings ruled over Bosnia. And the fascists, they are obsessed with the past, while on the other hand, communists, they are obsessed with abolishing the past, with annihilating the past, destroying all tradition and culture from the past, and creating a new society, a completely new society. They themselves claim that the utopia of Marx was actually never achieved, and they aim to create something completely new. And of course, if we look at the reality of communism, most communist regimes actually never really outgrew the traditions that existed in their areas, which is why communism got combined with cult of personality and many other local customs that actually pre-existed communism. That is why Stalin often dog-whistled to Russian nationalists. But in theory, communists want to create something completely new, while in theory fascists well, they want to restore the past. And Pol Pot claimed that his main goal is restoring the 12th century Cambodia. That is the time where his country Cambodia was at the peak of its power, at least when you look at the territory of the 12th century Cambodia. It was one of the largest powers in Southeastern Asia. And here you can see the paintings from the painter Van Nat. He was captured by the Khmer Rouge and forced to draw propaganda posters for Pol Pot, and he survived his horrible captivity, and he was traumatized by the things he saw, and he later lived on to paint in this picture himself, painting propaganda posters for Pol Pot. He was forced to draw posters of Pol Pot and other propaganda posters, but here he is depicting the evils done by the Khmer Rouge regime. By the way, one of the most bloodthirsty regimes on earth. They killed 40% of their population, the Khmer Rouge did. And here we can see how they tortured their enemies, also by Van Nat. But yeah, I wanted to explain why, in my humble opinion, Pol Pot should be actually classified as a right-winger, in a sense that he also aimed to restore this mythical past. And I do agree with those that claim that it is actually very hard to classify him. And the point of this video is sort of more of to just raise this question and portray to you that sometimes it is not easy to classify a regime, especially if a regime is one of the most bizarre and weirdest regimes that ever existed in history. So yes, on the one hand, he definitely was a communist. He claimed to be, but on the other hand, his ideal state, according to him, was 12th century Cambodia. That was the ideal state. Feudalism, very primitive feudalism, was the ideal state for Pol Pot, or at least he claimed so. And I don't know what the hell is happening in this picture. There is a flying baby, but Van Nat also is showing us the brutality of the Khmer Rouge regime in this picture. And yeah, this is how the ideal Khmer Empire looked for Pol Pot, and you can see that his neighbors didn't appreciate the effort. We are talking about the Vietnamese, about Vietnam, which is why almost immediately after winning the civil war, Pol Pot actually went to war with his neighbors. And Pol Pot was a crazy individual, which is why he not only wanted to exterminate all the Vietnamese people on his soil, he claimed he wants to exterminate all Vietnamese people in Vietnam. And when you realize that Vietnam had a population that's 5 times larger than Cambodia, then it becomes obvious that Pol Pot was truly crazy. One of those guys that simply diverged from reality a long time ago. And this is how the biggest temple complex in the world looks like, Angkor Wat, ancient Cambodian temple complex. And Pol Pot claimed in his speeches only a superior race could have built such a temple, but now our race is polluted by the Vietnamese and by many other smaller nations like the Shani people that are completely exterminated under the tyrannical rule of Pol Pot. And here you can see the ancient statues of Cambodian kings that Pol Pot imitated. Jaravayaman VII was Pol Pot's idol, and he claimed to be a person just like this ancient king. But yeah, my point is that if you want to see whether a regime is leftist or a right-wing fascist regime, generally speaking, you ask this one question: what about the past? is the past something to be idealized, or is the past something that should be eradicated and forgotten and abolished, and should we build a completely new society that never existed? Should we just try to abolish all tradition and try something completely new, or should we go back to the ancient wisdoms that made our people great? And Pol Pot answered, we should go back. We should go back, and he tried to stop the wheel of time, but it simply wasn't possible. You can't go back. You simply have to accept the world for what it is. And in his mad dream of going back, he forced all the people to leave the cities and work in the fields, and that caused, along with genocide and war with Vietnam, 40% of his own population to perish. But I'm probably going to make another video more explicitly about the genocide itself. And that's all for this video, and if you like the video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe.